Caro. Greetings, good morning to everyone. Respects to the elders, the ancestors, and all the energies that have brought us here today. I want to start, as we heard in the wonderful introduction, by framing things within the context of my larger project, Sacred Imaginaries Performing Africa, Decolonizing Blackness, where I analyze how Orisha practitioners negotiate multiple modernities through attention to their religious and performative practices. I argue that in African-centered religions, Trinidadians perform and negotiate identities beyond inherited colonial hierarchies, where they draw on spiritual epistemologies to engage in processes of decolonization by redefining conceptions such as Black, African, and even citizen. In today's talk, I am because they are devotion and intimacy in Trinidad Orisha. I want to explore the radical potential of erotic and sacred subjectivity to reimagine and transform our social and political landscapes. My reflections today are on a more theoretical side of my work, though they are ethnographically informed. I want to thank the organizers of today's gathering for their timely and inspiring selection of a theme. Love supreme, devotion, intimacy, and ecstasy in African and diasporic religions pushed me to articulate connections in my work in a new way, and I give thanks. At 50 years young, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago is a twin island nation state whose society, culture, politics, and economics all bear the hallmarks of a colonial legacy. While independence in 1967 occurred politically and symbolically on many levels, decolonization, which I insist is a process and not a singular event, decolonization did not naturally occur as a consequence. The framing argument of my book is that the Orisha religion in Trinidad informs a cultural citizenship rooted in the African diaspora that works as a decolonizing praxis. In looking for signs of decolonizing processes, what came to the forefront were critical engagements with inherited hierarchical legacies of identity along lines of race, ethnicity, color, gender, sexuality, and other distinctions of difference. These critical engagements were visible in performance practices, from aspects of the annual celebrations of Diwali, Jose, Carnival, and Pagua, to everyday reconfigurations of time and space, i.e. Trinidad's national pastime of liming. I have found the spiritual practices of West African-based religions at the heart of these critical performances. The Orisha tradition in Trinidad emerged, like so many Afro-Atlantic religions, within transnational spiritual networks that had touched ground at a particular historical conjuncture. In this specific instance, at the turn of the 19th century, a large influx of French planters and their slaves from the French colonies settled in Trinidad. Quote, from a mere 1,500, including only 200 slaves in 1780, the population of Trinidad grew to 17,500, 10,000 of them slaves by 1797, end quote. Among this population were both African and Creole slaves who practiced varying versions of African religions traditions. Now this is important, and I include it here because people think of Trinidad as a British colony, and indeed it was. But the entire Caribbean was Spanish before it was, in terms of colonial power, before it was anything else, right? And Trinidad was Spanish and was settled by French planters. So that strata of cultural and religious influence has shaped Trinidad Orisha. And it's outside the scope of today's paper, but in other venues, we can discuss how Trinidad Orisha is, I would argue, as close in many ways to Voodoo as it is to Santeria, right? We cannot just clump it. Okay, and I would be happy to talk about that more in Q&A. Many of these practices draw on religious traditions from the west coast of Africa, was what was then the Bight of Benin and the Gold Coast, what Hooke has called a family of religions. Throughout the diaspora, African descendants have remembered, created, and passed on spiritual practices and doctrines that have been called many names in Trinidad over the years: Shango, Chowder Baptist, and finally in contemporary times. Up in the foothills of the Santa Cruz Valley, just off of the east-west corridor of northern Trinidad, are several acres devoted to the Orisha. Ile, Iko, Shango, Milosha exists as one shrine of many in a country where the Orisha has been perpetuated for roughly 200 years and stands out from the many as an impressive deployment of resources. From the three-story Shango sculpture to the Egun Grove and Oshun fountain and pool surrounded by mirrors. There were other distinctions for the shrine, one more about absence than about presence. There is no spiritual Baptist church on the property, no space for Christian rituals. For at this shrine, the Orisha faith is practiced consciously as unmediated by Christianity. The spiritual source for this expression of Orisha faith is Ile Ife, or Oyo, Nigeria, and not the Vatican, or even Havana, Santiago, Miami, or Bahia, and finally, not Sande Grande, Mayaro, or any other local Trinidad town. In 1999, ISAM was founded by Iya Shangawumi, a.k.a. Pat McLeod. She was initiated in May of '99 in Oyo, Nigeria, escorted and guided there by Babalawo Wande and Bimbola the Awashe, whom she had worked with on the Orisha Congress. After her initiation to Shango, she would return to Trinidad to host the 6th World Orisha Congress that August and start to develop her shrine. This was one of many manifestations that she would undertake based on the direction of Orisha and Ifa to manifest her project to recenter and revalorize the Orisha faith in Trinidad while contributing to the healing of social ills, such as illiteracy, inequities, domestic violence, etc. Now I'm going to talk in a little bit more theoretically about a notion of erotic and sacred subjectivity, but I highlight Iya Shangawumi as a case study, not to hold her up as perfect, not to hold her up as somebody above mistakes and above human failings, but to hold her up as somebody whose love for community, whose devotion to service is informed by her intimate relationship with spirit. Iya Shangawumi's other projects, past and present, include a secondary school, Yoruba language courses for adults, a carnival masquerade band based on Orisha Oshun, to name just a few. All of these endeavors are informed by her faith, vision, and spiritual knowledge acquired through divination, dreams, and manifestation, and her conviction to make a positive impact on her community. I would like to insist that one way to understand the impetus to build and contribute to community, is that 5? Oh no. Is to live well together in the manner suggested by Allah Suwada, that is informed by communion with and knowledge from spirit. When this informs a being and becoming in the world, we can talk of a spiritual subjectivity. When understood in the vein of Audre Lorde, M. Jackie Alexander, Jafari Allen, that I will speak of or would have spoken of, I want to recognize this as erotic sacred subjectivity. Rather than solely locating an agency informed by love, devotion, and intimacy to the realm of interpersonal relationships or to the realms of a specific Orisha, say Oshun, I want to step back and see our engagement with all forms of spirit as such a form of erotic agency. So there's a section here where I link this with processes of decolonization, and I hope that you guys will just believe me. All right? So I talk about a sacred imaginary, right? So that informs the imagination of what is possible social and politically. And I talk about a spiritually informed decolonizing praxis, right? So I want to get to the link that I make probably in conclusion, that this conference helped me to give to my work. So as I said earlier, as an aside, that this project, this link, is just a bud that is about to unfold, and I'm really grateful to this opportunity to link the idea of a decolonizing praxis and a cultural citizenship with spiritual epistemology, the sacred and the erotic, and a subjectivity informed by that. What is at the heart of spiritual epistemology? My reflections have led me to an erotic and sacred subjectivity that arises out of the intimate relationship with the divine that is the basis for this knowledge. Rather than a cold clinical knowledge of science, and not that there isn't a science to this knowledge, there is a warm, engaged, and powerful coming together of being and becoming that is both deeply erotic and deeply sacred. A knowledge that is transcendent in the transformative and spiritual meaning of the word, one with the potential, and I'm quoting Alan here, to break down parts of the scaffolding of oppression, end quote. Building on Lord's idea of the erotic and Alexander's erotic autonomy, we find in Alan's recent ethnography on the erotics of Black self-making in Cuba, a definition of the erotic closely linked to subjectivity, to the being and becoming of the subject, which, quote, works towards not only transgressing, but transcending and finally transforming hegemonies of global capital, the state, and of bourgeoisie, limited and limiting notions of gender, sexuality, or blackness, end quote. I propose that it is the intimate connection with spirit of all kinds and connections of many types, that animate and inform what Audre Lorde refers to as, quote, the deep longing within, end quote. A site which Jafari Allen reminds us is, quote, a site of knowledge, production, and energy, which is alternative to regimes of the state and received culture, end quote. I would like to conclude, speak a little bit more on Allen's pushing us further to understand a more holistic understanding of subjective agency that can inform a counterpublic. And one is informed by the sacred imaginary that I developed in earlier work. So I link then from the sacred imaginary to the counterpublic to this erotic sacred subjectivity. I use Allen's formulation of erotic subjectivity with its indebtedness to Lord and Alexander as a frame from which to explore love, devotion, and intimacy in the Yoruba diasporic religion of Trinidad Orisha. I propose that this frame will help to illuminate the radical potential for decolonization within the practices of community of Orisha and now Ifa in Trinidad. In closing, I ask, what is the power for transformation, for a transcendence that is based in an erotic, sacred subjectivity, as discussed briefly here today? In developing a theory of how divine knowledge informs systems of belonging, I say that not only is there room to explore the profound personal bounds of people with spirits and vice versa, but that it is within the erotic sacred subjectivity of that bond that we can locate the power for transcendence and transformation. A power that, when tied to the social and political, becomes a sacred praxis of decolonization. A power to free our minds, our spirits, our desires, our bodies, and a power to free our love. Ashe.